Welcome, friends, to another episode of Automation Digest. Today, we will be talking about in memory database. Yes, you heard it right. In memory database. What is it? In a traditional database, we store the data in disk. In memory database relies on RAM or main memory because it does not have any disk where we need to store the data. It's comparatively faster. When it comes to testing, we can perform isolated testing using in-memory database where one test is not going to impact the result of others. Every time the data that we use will be a fresh one. There are many examples of in-memory database available in the market like Redis, H2 database, Memcached. Today we would be taking help of H2 database to create a table, insert data into the table, then print the value which was inserted in the table. So let's get into our IntelliJ and perform those activities. I have already created a class called in-memory database for simplicity. The first thing that we need for an in-memory database is the dependency. I have added the dependency for com.h2 database. Alright, once we have added the dependency, let's go back to our code. To connect to any database, we require the URL. For H2 database, the URL would be something like the first thing, which is JDBC colon H2, represents that we are using a H2 database. The second parameter called mem represents in-memory database in use. The last parameter, which is demo DB, can be anything as per our preference. This is the DB instance or the in-memory database instance that we are creating. Next thing we want to do is create the connection. The username and password needs to be provided. For H2 database, the username is always going to be SA and the password is going to be blank. So we have created the connection. Now let's create a table. Let's use 4 columns in the table. The first one being ID. Let's make it the primary key. Next, let's have a name, which would be varchar. Let's add the next one as is the person working or not. Let's have the data type as Boolean. And the last one, let's have a date of birth and the data type as date. Now that we have written the create query, let's execute it. Once we execute this query, the table gets created. But how can we be sure if the table is actually created? So I can have a query to show the columns from the table. Now the return type of execute is Boolean. If we want to store the result in a result set, we would require to use the method called execute query. This can be used to store the data in a result set. Now from this result set, we can extract the detail that we require. To get the detail of all the column headers, we require the metadata of the table. So we would be using a method called get metadata. That will give us result set metadata. Once we have the metadata in place, we can get the column name, the column count, the column type, etc. So for now, let's use the column count so that we can loop through the column and get all the column headers and the values. Let us store this result in an integer. Now that we have got the column count, let's print the values of the result set. So we require 2 values. One is the column header and second, the column values. To get the column headers, we would require to use metadata, which means the statement would look something like result set dot get metadata dot get column name. Whereas to get the value, we would directly get it from the result set. So the statement would look like result set dot get string. Now to see the number of rows present in our result set, we would require to use a while loop to check if we have data in the result set. To iterate through the columns to get the detail, we would require another for loop to start from 1 to the column length. If I execute this code, we have all the details in our output. The first one was ID, second name, then working and DOB. All the details are mentioned here as well. Now, once we have created the table, we would require to insert data inside it. So let's have our query created for inserting the data. When we have our data prepared, those will replace the question mark in line number 31. And this would give us the data inserted into the table. Let's add 50 values into the table. So we would require a loop to iterate 50 times. Before that, we require to create the prepared statement. The first value is ID and it requires integer value. So we will use the column 1 question mark should be replaced by I. For the second one, which is name, let's have user plus I. The third one is a boolean value. The boolean value can be either true or false. So we'll create an array of true and false, and we will insert true for even numbers and false for odd numbers. Perfect. That would give us true and false alternatively. Next one is a date of birth, which means we require the date. Now let's randomize this value as well. First, let's define the range of date of birth. Now let's create a random value out of this. Finally, let's execute the prepared statement. This would insert 50 records into the table. To check the details of the table inserted, we would require the select query. So let's execute the select query before inserting the data and after inserting the data. Let's have the same code again after inserting the data. All right, on execution, if you notice, right after the description of the table, we have after insertion. After insertion, we can see the data as we wanted. So ID 0, user 0, true, some random date of birth, ID gets incremented, username gets changed, working is again false, and a random date of birth as well. If you keep scrolling down, you would have 50 data because we inserted 50 rows. Now, all this data were from in-memory database, because of which everything was instantaneous. We did not require to use any additional network bandwidth. We did not require to store the data in our disk. It was all in RAM or main memory. We can utilize this for a lot of scenarios in our testing environment. We can manipulate the data as per our test case requirement and execute it in isolation. This is some of the example that we can do with in-memory database. That's all for today. I'll come back with few exciting videos. Till then, stay tuned. Happy coding.